as the nation continues to mourn the passing away of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, one of the tallest leaders of Indian politics, we at ET Now want to celebrate the legacy that he leaves behind, not just politically but economically as well. And who better than someone who's associated with him very closely and worked with him on game-changing reforms. N.K. Singh, who was a secretary to Mr. Vajpayee and currently is the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, joins us right here. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Singh, for sparing time and being with us. My heartfelt condolences to you on the demise of Mr. Vajpayee. But you know, his final journey, in some sense, was very, very symbolic. The Prime Minister leading the procession, extremely significant. He walked for about 6 kilometers with the entire top brass of the Bharatiya Janata Party. How symbolic a gesture do you think this really was?
I think it has a huge value which goes beyond symbolism. It suggests the deep, abiding commitment and dedication which the Prime Minister and his senior colleagues have in recognizing the contribution that Mr. Vajpayee had made in shaping India's modern economic destiny, in terms of shaping modern economic policies, in terms of giving new contours to India's foreign policy. And I think that this represents, the long walk represents the Prime Minister's continued commitment to the values cherished by late Mr. Vajpayee.
Indeed, a very symbolic gesture there, and which is why I think that visual does tell a story. But, you know, it's time to look back at the legacy Atalji leaves behind. Does Atal Bihari Vajpayee get the credit for transforming the Bharatiya Janata Party from a right-wing Baniya party with limited appeal into a national party? He gave it the credibility. He established the fact that Bharatiya Janata Party could govern. And did his economic policies play a big role in this image makeover?
I don't know whether I would like to join you or endorse some of the hyperboles which you have used in terms of what BJP was, a narrow right-wing party. But it is a fact that I think Mr. Advani played, along with Mr. Vajpayee, an important role in giving the organizational strength. And Mr. Vajpayee provided the kind of political and economic leadership. I mean, for instance, let us not forget the fact that when Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, a sagacious man, walked away from the Pokhran nuclear explosion, it was because he was very conscious of the 1991 crisis, of what sanctions could mean in terms of India's economic growth. Mr. Vajpayee had conquered that risk. He had conquered by recognizing that if he opened up India's market, if he liberalized, if he unleashed forces of productivity and change, the growing Indian market and the growing entrepreneurship will prevent any deep-cutting sanctions and which will rapidly get India back into the international fold. It is surprising that India, far from being ostracized, became a strategic partner of the United States, even during Mr. Vajpayee's tenure.
Yeah, you know, because you spoke about Pokhran and because you talked about the international fold, I must ask you this question. You're right. He managed to do Pokhran and still overturned the Indo-US relations. You know, I mean, who can forget the Talbot, Jaswant Singh talks and how things were turned around, Brajesh Mishra in tow. But of course, Mr. Vajpayee presided over all that. Remember, these relations were strained following the nuke test. How was that achieved? And was he convinced that the US may actually only bark but not bite? Or was he really banking on the lure of the Indian market that the developed world could perhaps no longer ignore?
I think it was a combination of many factors. It was a combination of human chemistry, the fact that Mr. Vajpayee had remarkable ability to influence and win friends across territories, across boundaries, a recognition that innately the values which Mr. Vajpayee cherished were values also fundamental to important democracy like the United States. That coupled with two other factors. First, don't forget that in terms of beginning the actual dialogue, the dialogue itself was a two-track dialogue. Track one was the dialogue between the strategic national security advisor, one of the most sagacious, wise men that the Foreign Service has seen, having a series of discussions with Condoleezza Rice and with Sandy Berger, the then National Security Advisor, along with promoting and quietly fostering the Strobe Talbot Jaswant Singh kind of dialogue which took place. So along with this, it was his own personal leadership which enabled the US to develop comfort enough in recognizing that India was going to be not only a long-term economic prosperous trading power, but would provide the international community business opportunities which the world had not seen before.
Mr. Singh, formal economics was not Atalji's forte, and yet he could script some big reforms. Was it smart delegation? Was it betting on the right people? Because all of these reforms required him to resist the pressure from the right-wingers, from the RSS, from the Swadeshi. He had to trump over the desi economics to usher in the reforms. What made him script them successfully? Was it the right delegation, or was it betting on the right people?
You know, I think that it has long been said that great leadership does not come from formal training. It comes from instincts. It comes from what people perceive is really the right course of action. After hearing everybody, he was open to receiving many suggestions. After all, it is he who formed the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. It is he who formed the Prime Minister's Council on Trade and Industry. Got some of the best minds in economics and the best minds in trade and industry to give him the best possible advice which was possible. In the end, he would get this advice scrutinized. He's tried to find a path which would have the maximum degree of consensus, but the final decision was his instinct or what he believed would be beneficial to the Indian economy.
You know, I have a very curious question to ask of you, because I remember as a young journalist, I covered telecom then. His handling of the telecom crisis, which would have made the industry go belly up, considering the over enthusiastic bids that they would have put in, and banks go bust, and it would have the stress would have reflected on banks' balance sheets, perhaps has some parallels to be drawn today when you do need a firm hand to deal with NPAs. I mean, we are once again staring at a possible industry goes belly up and banks in a bit of a mess. Does it tell you that you need a firm hand without perception management to deal with NPAs, and not perhaps the most complex fiscal solutions to be put on the table? Is there a parallel that one can draw from how he managed the bad loans and the possible turning up of the telecom sector to what's happening today?
Well, I think that the two examples are not symmetric. I think the problems of that time were far less complex than the problems of sorting out this twin balance sheet problem. This problem of the twin balance sheet problem, do not forget, is a legacy which this government has inherited. The issue of the telecom was the making of that time. It was not it was a very limited legacy in terms of the telecom companies having bid exceedingly high and preposterous prices and the banks having lent on optimistic assumption. This is very different than the problem of the twin balance sheet to which you have alluded, which has been built up over a very long period of time. It is endemic to the having not had the necessary reforms in our banking and financial system. It is a kind of festering problem to which only small bandages and emulations have been done. That requires a redressal in different ways. And I think this government has moved, in all fairness, with great expedition and great speed. The Insolvency Bankruptcy Act, the world has acclaimed, is an important decisive step. The way in which we are going about handling the NCLT and so on are bound to yield results. But a festering problem of decades is taking some time, but you will see very beneficial outcomes emerging from some sagacious, important and bold initiatives which the government has taken.
You know, Mr. Singh, I have to ask you this question. This is a majority government, and this is the first majority government in economically liberalized India. And yet this government finds it tough to ward off pressure, whether it's pressure from the Swadeshi lobby, whether it's the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, the RSS and the likes. In some sense, was Mr. Vajpayee's biggest success that he could manage to firewall government from the party. How did he manage to do that? And more importantly, did that help people like you to take the bold economic decisions that were taken during his tenure?
Well, I think that he did succeed, and very, very decisively succeeded firewalling the party, the organization, and the political spillover or managing opposition parties from decision making. I think that he firewalled it by a system of consensus making, which was personal to him and personal to his political advisors, but it did not allow this process to spill over into the actual governance fabric. Indeed, that can equally be said of the present government. We do not see really any spillover of any organizational or other issues. In fact, I think that one of the great attributes of this government is that the organization and the government has worked in a harmony which is quite rare.
Okay, you've chosen to call it, and in your rather emotional pieces that you've written, both for the Times of India and the Indian Express earlier today, you've chosen to call Vajpayee era a watershed, not just in economy, but in foreign policy as well. What will you attribute the watershed moment in foreign policy to?
I say so for two reasons. I say so, first of all, on the economic front. I say so because I think that the Vajpayee era proved one important fact, that an interdependent India, which liberalizes rapidly, which opens up the Indian market, which unleashes forces of productivity, and which allows really the whole world's capital to seek gainful opportunities here, that gives India a kind of economic heft and power from which I think no political party would like to walk away. There can be differences in the pace of orchestration, there can be differences on the sequencing, but I think that that broad picture remains, that no political party would want to walk away from the path of unleashing India's economic productivity and growth liberalizing factors. On the political front, I think that it leaves out that an India can play, given a growing economic heft, a far more important role politically in the world than an India which is autarkic and an India which seeks a policy of isolationism. So I think both on the economic and the political front, the need for following policies suitable to an interdependent world and suitable to India's growing economic and political power is a lesson and a legacy that Mr. Vajpayee has left behind.
Fair point. You also make an important comment. You talk about parliamentary management and governance isn't about winning arguments as it is about winning friends. And who would have perhaps known that better than Atalji, who could walk across the aisle, who had friends both in the opposition, in the ruling coalition. He had a picture of PV Narasimha Rao in his office because he considered him a friend, and he said, my friends don't change by their political dispensation. Is there a lesson to be drawn? Is there a lesson to be learnt by the present parliamentarians on making friends across the political aisle?
Well, I think that that's a universal lesson. I think that leave aside the present or leave aside that. Mr. Vajpayee genuinely believed, and I have mentioned in that sometimes the most tense situations could be diffused by his characteristic one-liner poetry, his repartee, his sense of humor, and cracking a joke which would ease the tension which prevailed at that time. He believed that the way forward in a complex democracy was to win not the argument, but to win friends, because democracy is about winning friends, and decision making based on wider consensus is a path forward. This indeed, I think, is a universal lesson, and I don't think this government is failing in that pursuit. It's trying to win friends. Look at the number of allies that the government has. This allies list are broadening every day and with every turn of events. This is a lesson which Mr. Vajpayee, in having to manage, don't forget that he managed 13 political parties, and that is a greater challenge than managing a majoritarian government or a government which is based on a majority. He practiced what he believed. He believed long-term economic and political changes need wider societal consensus, and he worked towards that objective.
Okay, I do have a question for you, and I think this largely comes from the kind of people who were around Mr. Vajpayee, whether it was you, whether it was Brijesh Mishra, Jaswant Singh, the people that he relied upon were not desi men. And today it seems being desi is a calling card. It's a virtue to be desi. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in quite contrast, bet on English-speaking, golf-playing men who enjoyed their mutton as much as the mutt. So in some sense, there is quite a contrast in the calling card of people who have high currency in New Delhi now vis-a-vis people who had it then.
In my view, that is a false and not a very accurate dichotomy which Supriya is trying to draw. I don't think that the present government in any way is inward looking. Then if you look at the number of large international foreign investors, or large important political shapers, or large set of intellectuals who have free access to the highest decision-making authorities in India, you'll find that number and you'll find that quality mind-boggling. So I think that any apprehension that we are suddenly turning inward or suddenly becoming isolationist, in my view, would be really a misplaced understanding of the current events.
So a quick last word before I let you go. For a consensus maker that Atalji was, for the kind of political ideology that he had, for being the moderate in his own party, often called the wrong man, the right man in the wrong party, would he have been a political misfit in today's polity that's extremely polarized, that's extremely abrasive? This polity doesn't know of tensions being diffused by one line of poetry or issues being sorted out by just saying, "Chaliye chai peete hain."
Challenges change with time. Today's challenges and complexities are vastly different than the era in which Vajpayee grew and Vajpayee flourished. The needs of today are definitely more complex than what the luxury was of the yesteryears in which Mr. Vajpayee had grown up in that political milieu. It's difficult to juxtapose time, and it is therefore difficult to draw one lesson which would be valid for other times.
Okay, completely out of time here, but thank you very much, Mr. N.K. Singh, for sparing time and speaking to us on the iconic Atalji. You've been a close associate, you've worked with him closely, and so we really appreciate you taking time out and speaking to us. Thanks very much for being with us on ET Now. We take a breather and we'll be back with plenty more of news, views and analysis right here on this channel.